He thought humiliating her would be effortless. But he had no idea he had just handed her the keys to everything. The boardroom of Harrington Dynamics gleamed under cold white lights. A 40-foot glass wall overlooked downtown Manhattan where yellow cabs moved like restless currents below. Inside, the air was thick, not with noise but with pressure. Spreadsheets flickered across a massive screen, projections in the hundreds of millions blinking red one after another. Voices overlapped, executives in tailored suits argued in clipped, impatient tones, each trying to salvage a deal that was slipping through their fingers. Daniel Harrington stood at the head of the table, calm, almost amused, his silver watch catching the light as he raised his hand, and the room fell into immediate silence. This was his world, his battlefield, his rules, so no one in this room can fix it, he said, slowly scanning faces that suddenly avoided his gaze. The CFO shifted uncomfortably. A senior analyst cleared his throat but said nothing. The tension tightened like a drawn wire, and then Daniel smiled, not kindly but with the quiet confidence of someone who had already decided the outcome. He turned to the screen, picked up a marker and wrote a dense line of equations across the financial model, numbers, variables, assumptions layered into something that looked almost impossible to untangle. Solve this, he said lightly, and you own my company. A ripple of laughter broke out around the table, not loud but sharp enough to carry meaning. It wasn't a real offer, it was a performance, a display of power. And then his eyes drifted to the far end of the room where she sat, barely noticeable. Sophia Bennett, her navy blazer simple, her posture straight, her presence almost invisible. She had been there for 6 weeks and most people still couldn't remember her name. She was the intern, the note taker, the quiet one. Daniel tilted his head slightly as if just remembering she existed, or maybe, he added, his tone soft but cutting, you just keep taking notes, sweetheart. The laughter came easier this time. A few smirks exchanged across the table. Someone whispered something under their breath and shook their head, but Sophia didn't react, at least not at first. Her pen hovered over the page, then stopped completely. Her fingers tightened just enough to crease the paper. Her eyes lifted, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a stillness that didn't belong in that room. Something shifted, not loud, not visible, but undeniable. She closed her notebook, gently placed the pen down, and for a brief moment the noise in the room faded into something distant, like it no longer mattered. She stood, the chair sliding back with a soft, controlled sound that somehow echoed louder than any argument before it. Every head turned, not because they expected anything but because they didn't. Daniel watched her now, curiosity flickering behind his composed expression as she stepped forward, each step measured, unhurried, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor until she reached the front of the room. She didn't reach for the marker, she didn't rush to speak, she simply looked at the screen, studying it as if she had seen something no one else had. And in that silence something unfamiliar crept into the room, not doubt, not yet, but the absence of certainty. And then finally she spoke, her voice calm, steady, almost quiet. May I? And for the first time since the meeting began no one laughed. Daniel did not answer immediately. He studied her as if weighing whether this moment was worth his time. The faint hum of the city outside seemed to fade as every executive in the room turned toward the quiet intern who had just done the unthinkable. Finally he gave a small, dismissive nod. Go ahead, he said, leaning back in his chair as if the outcome had already been decided. A few people exchanged glances. Someone muttered under their breath, this was going to be embarrassing. Sophia stepped closer to the screen, her reflection faintly visible in the glass behind it. Rows of numbers cascaded across the display, projections, assumptions, risk factors, all meticulously constructed by some of the most experienced minds in the company. She did not rush, she did not even reach for the marker. At first her eyes moved slowly, scanning line by line as if she were listening to something beneath the noise, something no one else could hear. The chief financial officer crossed his arms, watching with thinly veiled skepticism, while one of the senior analysts shook his head quietly, already preparing to look away. Daniel tapped his finger once against the table, a subtle signal of impatience. Take your time, he said with a hint of amusement, though his tone suggested the opposite. Sophia finally lifted her hand and picked up the marker. The sound of it clicking against the board seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness. She did not begin solving the equation, she did not rearrange the structure. Instead she paused, her hand hovering just inches from the screen, and then with a single smooth motion she drew a small line through one variable, a quiet, precise strike so minimal that for a moment no one reacted. It was too simple, too insignificant to matter, or so they thought. A faint scoff broke the silence from the far side of the table. That is it, someone whispered, but Sophia did not turn. She wrote a new value beneath it, not dramatically, not with flourish, just one clean correction. Then she stepped back, placing the marker down exactly where she had found it, and for a moment nothing happened. The room remained still, suspended between disbelief and confusion, until the chief financial officer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he recalculated silently, his fingers moving slightly as if tracing invisible numbers in the air. His expression shifted, first subtly then unmistakably, his posture straightened the color drain just enough from his face to be noticed. "Wait," he said quietly, almost to himself. He looked again, faster this time, then once more, as if hoping to prove himself wrong, but the numbers did not lie. A low murmur spread across the table. Daniel frowned, now sitting upright, his earlier confidence flickering as he stepped forward, his gaze locking onto the exact line she had changed. He recalculated quickly, his mind racing through the implications, and then it hit him: the foundation of the entire model had shifted. What once projected loss now pointed toward stability. What seemed impossible moments ago suddenly made sense in a way that was both simple and devastatingly clear. Daniel exhaled slowly, though the room could feel the weight behind it. "Sophia finally spoke, her voice calm, unshaken. The assumption in that line was wrong. Everything after it follows the wrong direction." No one interrupted, no one laughed, even the air felt different now, as if the room itself had realized something it had missed. Daniel stared at the screen longer than necessary, then at her, and in that brief moment the balance of power shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because what he had offered as a joke had just been answered, and somewhere beneath his composed exterior he knew this was no longer a game. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, and in a room where every second was measured in dollars, that silence felt louder than any argument. Daniel Harrington slowly placed both hands on the table, leaning forward just enough to reassert presence, but not enough to hide what had just happened. His eyes moved from the screen to Sophia and back again, as if trying to reconcile the equation with the person who had altered it. "Walk me through it," he said. Finally, his voice lower, now stripped of its earlier amusement. Sophia did not hesitate. She stepped closer again, not to take control but because she already understood it. "The growth rate assumption here," she pointed gently, not dramatically, "was calculated using last quarter's adjusted projections, not the raw data." A few heads turned quickly toward the chief financial officer, who stiffened slightly. Sophia continued, her tone calm, almost instructional. "That creates a feedback loop. The model amplifies a trend that does not actually exist, so every downstream variable follows a distorted path." She paused just long enough for the room to catch up. "When you correct that one input, everything realigns." The chief financial officer swallowed quietly, his earlier confidence replaced with something tighter, more careful. "We reviewed that adjustment 3 times, he said defensively, though not aggressively. Sophia nodded once. "Yes, but each review used the same corrected sheet, so the error carried forward without being questioned." The words landed softly, but their impact was precise, like a door closing somewhere no one had noticed before. Daniel straightened fully now, his expression unreadable as he turned to the screen again, recalculating not just the numbers but the situation itself. The deal that had seemed impossible minutes ago now revealed a path forward, one that none of his senior team had seen. The implications moved quickly behind his eyes: cost recovery, timelines, risk mitigation, leverage, positioning, all of it shifting because of one overlooked detail. He exhaled slowly. This time there was no performance in it, just recognition. Around the table, the executives who had laughed moments earlier now sat still, their posture different, their attention no longer scattered but fixed entirely on the intern they had barely acknowledged. One of the senior analysts leaned forward, quietly rechecking the model on his tablet, his brow furrowed deeper with each second until he stopped and looked up, unable to hide the conclusion. "She is right," he said simply, and that was the moment everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. Daniel turned to Sophia again. This time there was no trace of dismissal in his gaze, only calculation and something else, something closer to respect though not yet fully formed. "How long did it take you to see that?" he asked. Sophia met his eyes evenly. "About 10 seconds. A faint shift moved through the room, not shock exactly but something heavier, the realization that what had taken a room full of experts hours of debate had taken her seconds of clarity. Daniel let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh, but without humor. 10 seconds, he repeated as if testing the weight of it. His fingers tapped once against the table again, but this time the gesture was not impatience, it was thought, the kind that comes when control begins to slip. And then he said it more to himself than anyone else. Interesting. Because what he was beginning to understand was not just that she had solved the problem, but that she had seen something none of them even thought to question, and in a room built on certainty that was the most dangerous thing of all. The air in the boardroom did not return to normal after that moment. It shifted into something sharper, something more aware, as if every person present suddenly realized they were no longer the smartest one in the room. Daniel Harrington slowly walked around the table, not hurried, not uncertain, but deliberate, his polished shoes echoing softly against the floor, until he stopped just a few feet from Sophia Bennett. He studied her more carefully now, not as an afterthought, not as background, but as a variable he had failed to account for. 10 seconds. He repeated again, this time quieter, almost reflective, as if measuring the gap between perception and reality. His gaze flicked briefly to the executives seated around him, men And women with decades of experience who had built their careers on precision and certainty, and yet none of them had seen what she saw. Not one. The chief financial officer cleared his throat, attempting to regain some ground. It was a subtle misalignment, he said carefully, an easy oversight under pressure. But the words felt thinner than they sounded because everyone in the room knew pressure was exactly where they were supposed to perform. Daniel did not respond to him. Instead he turned back to Sophia. Where did you learn to see that? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was not. Sophia did not shift under it. She did not lower her eyes or rush to justify herself. I look at patterns, she said calmly, not just results. A faint pause followed, as if the room needed time to process how little she had said and how much it revealed. Daniel nodded once slowly, then looked back at the screen again. The corrected model, now glowing with clarity. What had seemed complex before now appeared almost obvious, and that was the most unsettling part. Not that they had missed it, but that it had been there the entire time, waiting for someone willing to question it. Run it again, Daniel said without looking away from the screen. The senior analyst moved quickly, fingers tapping across his tablet, recalculating in real time the numbers, updated line by line, projections, stabilizing margins, correcting risk ratios, aligning into something viable, something strong. A low murmur passed through the room. But it was not disbelief anymore, it was recognition, and beneath that something quieter, something closer to respect. Daniel finally turned back to Sophia fully, this time no distraction, no divided attention. You said the entire model follows the wrong direction because of that line, he said. What else follows that assumption? The question hung heavier than the others because it was no longer about the equation, it was about everything connected to it. Sophia met his gaze evenly. Every decision built on it, she replied simply, and the room went still again, not because they did not understand but because they did. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger but in realization, because if that assumption had been wrong, then every strategy, every projection, every risk assessment tied to it carried the same flaw. And for the first time that morning the man who controlled the room understood that control was not as absolute as he believed. He glanced once more at the executives around him, then back at Sophia, and something in his expression shifted. Not defeat, not yet, but the beginning of something far more dangerous, awareness, because the question was no longer whether she was right, the question was how much they had built on being wrong. The weight of that realization did not fade, it deepened, settling over the room like something no one could easily shake. Daniel Harrington remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the screen, but his focus no longer on the numbers alone, it was on what they represented: decisions made, strategies approved, confidence placed in a foundation that had just been quietly dismantled by a single correction. He exhaled slowly, then turned back to the table, his presence shifting once again, but not to dominate this time, to reassess, pull the last 6 months of projections tied to that model, he said calmly. The senior analyst nodded immediately, fingers already moving across the tablet. The pace in the room changed, not frantic, not chaotic, but precise, controlled. Every person now working with a new awareness, as if the margin for error had suddenly narrowed to zero. The chief financial officer adjusted his posture, straightening slightly as he leaned forward. If that assumption carried through multiple cycles, then the exposure could be larger than we thought, he said, his voice measured but tighter than before. Daniel gave a slight nod. Then we need to know exactly how large, he replied simply. His gaze flicked once more toward Sophia, who had stepped back slightly, returning to stillness, as if her role in the moment had already ended. But it had not. The room had not returned to ignoring her, not anymore. One of the executives who had laughed earlier now avoided looking in her direction altogether, while another studied her with quiet curiosity, trying to reconcile her presence with what they had just witnessed. Daniel noticed all of it, not openly, but nothing in that room escaped him for long. He walked back toward his chair but did not sit. Instead he rested one hand lightly against the back of it, his attention divided between the unfolding recalculations and the intern who had altered the trajectory of the meeting. You said every decision built on that assumption follows the same flaw, he said without raising his voice. Sophia nodded once. Yes, she replied, it compounds over time. The words were simple, but the implication was not. The senior analyst looked up again, this time more quickly. The adjusted model shows a positive swing of nearly 30% over the next 2 quarters if corrected now, he said, a note of disbelief still lingering in his tone. Another voice followed, and if not corrected, the answer came just as quickly, we would have committed to a strategy that would underperform significantly within 12 months. A quiet stillness followed, not shock this time but understanding, the kind that settles in slowly and does not leave. Daniel finally pulled his chair back and sat down, but his posture was different now, less relaxed, more engaged. His fingers interlocked briefly on the table before separating again. So the deal was never the problem, he said softly, more to himself than anyone else. Our interpretation was No one disagreed because there was nothing left to argue against. He looked across the table once more, then back to Sophia, his expression steady but no longer distant. "You saw that in seconds," he said. Not as a question but as a fact. Sophia met his gaze without hesitation. "I questioned the starting point," she said. Everything else followed. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not approval, not yet, but acknowledgement, because in that room built on expertise, hierarchy and certainty, a quiet intern had just revealed something far more valuable than a solution. She had revealed a blind spot, and the most unsettling part was not that it existed but that it had taken her to see it. No one returned to their previous confidence after that moment. The room continued moving, but with a different rhythm, sharper, quieter, more deliberate, as if every calculation now carried the weight of what had just been exposed. Daniel Harrington leaned back slightly in his chair, not relaxed but recalibrating. His eyes moved across the updated projections as they stabilized on the screen. Numbers that had once signaled risk now aligned into something far more promising, yet instead of satisfaction there was a trace of tension beneath his composure, because clarity often revealed more than it resolved. "Lock in that corrected model and rerun the full scenario analysis," he said. His voice even controlled. The senior analyst nodded, immediately adjusting inputs, while another executive began cross-checking historical data to confirm the pattern. Sophia remained where she was, no longer at the front but not invisible either. Her presence now carried a quiet gravity that no one in the room could ignore. Even those who had not spoken since the shift found themselves glancing toward her as if expecting something more, something they had missed. Daniel noticed that as well, not outwardly, but his attention registered every subtle change, the way posture shifted, the way voices lowered, the way certainty had been replaced with caution. He rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers no longer tapping. "But still, if this correction holds across prior quarters, then our entire risk profile changes," the chief financial officer said carefully. This time his tone carried less defense and more alignment. Daniel gave a slight nod. "Then we adjust accordingly," he replied simply, but his gaze moved again toward Sophia. "You saw the pattern, not just the error," he said. She met his eyes without hesitation. "The error reveals the pattern," she answered, her voice calm, measured. There was no arrogance in it, no attempt to claim more than what was already clear, and that made it land even deeper. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable but heavy with understanding. Daniel stood again, slowly, not abruptly but with intention, as he walked toward the screen, once more studying the corrected model as if committing it to memory. "Most people try to solve what they are given," he said quietly, almost reflective. "Very few question why it was built that way in the first place." He turned slightly, just enough to look back at the table, and fewer still are willing to erase it. No one responded because there was nothing to add. The truth of it was already evident. The senior analyst looked up again, this time with a different expression, not disbelief, not confusion, but respect. "The revised projections show sustained growth if implemented within the next 60 days, he said. Daniel nodded once, then looked back at Sophia fully, now his attention undivided. "What would you change next?" The question shifted the room again, because it was no longer about validation, it was about inclusion. Sophia paused, not out of uncertainty but precision. "I would review the assumptions feeding the next layer of projections," she said. "If one starting point was wrong, others might be built on the same logic." Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, slower this time, more deliberate, because what she had just offered was not a correction, it was a mindset. And in that moment the dynamic in the room changed. Again, not with noise, not with announcement, but with something far more powerful, recognition, because the intern they had overlooked was no longer an observer. She had become a factor in the outcome, and Daniel Harrington understood something now that he had not understood an hour earlier. The most dangerous variable in any system is the one no one thinks to question until it does. The room no longer felt like a place of authority, it felt like a place of recalibration. Every voice that spoke now carried a layer of caution, as if each word had to pass through a filter that had not existed before. Daniel Harrington remained standing near the screen, his reflection faint against the glass as the updated projections continued to stabilize into something the team had not expected just an hour ago. Opportunity built on correction rather than assumption. He folded his arms slowly, not defensively but thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the numbers one more time before shifting back toward the table. "Rebuild the decision tree based on the corrected inputs," he said. The instruction was immediate, precise, and this time no one hesitated. The senior analyst nodded, already moving, while another executive adjusted her notes with renewed focus. The chief financial officer leaned forward again, but this time there was no attempt to control the narrative, only to align with it. "If we adjust now, we can reposition before the next quarterly report." he said. Daniel gave a slight nod but did not respond right away. His attention drifted once more to Sophia Bennett, who stood quietly at the edge of the room, not seeking attention, not avoiding it, simply present, and that presence now carried weight, the kind that does not need to be announced because it has already been proven. You said earlier that you look at patterns, not results, Daniel said, his voice calm but direct. The room shifted again subtly as all attention followed his words. Sophia met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she replied, results can hide what patterns reveal. A faint silence followed as the meaning settled deeper. Daniel stepped away from the screen, now closing the distance between himself and the table, his posture upright, controlled but no longer distant. Most of the people in this room are trained to trust results, he said slowly. It is how they have built their careers. His eyes moved briefly across the executive seated before returning to her. And yet you chose to question them. Sophia did not answer immediately, not because she could not but because she did not rush answers. I questioned where they came from, she said finally, her voice steady. If the starting point is wrong, then the result is just a polished mistake. The words did not land as criticism but as clarity, and that distinction mattered. Daniel held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once slower than before, more deliberate. Polished mistake, he repeated quietly, as if committing the phrase to memory. Behind him the analyst spoke again. The revised scenario shows a stronger position than our original plan if executed within 45 days. Daniel did not turn immediately. Instead he remained where he was, as if weighing something beyond the numbers, something less visible but equally important. When he finally looked back at the screen, it was not with urgency but with control. Then we move forward with the correction, he said simply. The decision carried through the room without resistance. No one questioned it, no one hesitated, because the authority behind it had already been reinforced. But what had changed was how that authority was informed. Daniel turned back once more towards Sophia, his expression unreadable but no longer dismissive. You saw something everyone else missed, he said, not as praise but as fact. Sophia gave a small nod. I looked where no one else was looking, she replied, and for a brief moment the room fell into a silence that felt different from before, not tension, not uncertainty, but recognition, because in a space built on expertise, hierarchy and confidence, the most valuable perspective had come from the one person no one had thought to ask. And Daniel Harrington understood now that the most dangerous oversight is not the one you make but the one you never think to question until someone else does. Something had permanently shifted in the room and no one could pretend otherwise. The hierarchy still existed, the titles still mattered, but the certainty behind them had been quietly rewritten. Daniel Harrington walked back to his seat slowly, this time not out of hesitation but intention, his movements measured as if each step now carried awareness he had not needed before. He rested his hands on the table but did not sit immediately. Instead he looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces that had once mirrored his confidence and now reflected something else, something more cautious, more aware of what they might not see. We proceed with the corrected model, he said calmly, and the decision moved through the room without resistance. The analysts adjusted their projections, the executives refined their notes, and for the first time since the meeting began, the deal no longer felt like something slipping away. It felt controlled, stabilized, real. But beneath that surface there was something deeper, something unspoken. Daniel finally sat down, but his posture remained forward, engaged, his attention no longer divided between people and numbers but fully aware of both. Before we finalize anything, he said, his voice steady, I want every assumption feeding this model reviewed from the ground up. There was no objection, no hesitation, because everyone understood what had just been revealed. If one line could alter everything, then every line deserved scrutiny. The chief financial officer nodded immediately. We will rebuild the framework from the base inputs, he said, this time without defensiveness, only alignment. Daniel gave a slight nod, then turned his gaze once more towards Sophia Bennett, who stood quietly where she had stepped back earlier, her presence still calm, still unassuming, yet now impossible to ignore. You saw what others did not, he said, not as a compliment but as acknowledgement. So tell me, he continued, his tone even but carrying more weight than before, if you were responsible for this entire model, what would you question next? The room shifted again subtly, because this was no longer observation, it was invitation. Sophia did not rush to answer. Her eyes moved briefly to the screen, then back to Daniel, as if mapping the structure in her mind before speaking. I would question the inputs that were accepted without verification, she said, her voice steady, especially the ones that align too easily with expectations. A faint silence followed as the meaning settled deeper. Daniel leaned back slightly, this time not distancing himself but considering the implication. The ones that confirm what we already believe, he said quietly. Sophia nodded once. Yes, she replied, those are the easiest to trust and the hardest to challenge. The words carried through the room, not loudly but with precision. Because everyone understood them, the senior analyst glanced down at his tablet again, not to defend his work but to reassess it from a different angle, as if seeing it for the first time. We may need to audit the entire input chain, he said. Daniel did not look away from Sophia as he responded. Do it, he said simply. Then after a brief pause he added, start with the assumptions that required the least discussion. The instruction landed with quiet impact because it revealed something deeper than correction. It revealed awareness of how oversight happens not through complexity but through comfort. Sophia remained still, her expression unchanged, but in that stillness there was something undeniable. She had not only corrected the model, she had changed how the room thought about it. And Daniel Harrington understood now that the most dangerous flaw in any system is not the one hidden in complexity but the one protected by agreement. By now the room no longer belonged to hierarchy, it belonged to clarity. Every voice that spoke did so with intention, every movement carried awareness that something fundamental had shifted. Daniel Harrington remained seated, but his posture had changed again, no longer leaning back, no longer observing from distance. He was engaged, fully present as the revised model continued to take shape across the screen. The numbers no longer flickered with uncertainty, they held steady, grounded in something that felt more real, more reliable than before. Yet that stability did not bring comfort, it brought responsibility. I want every division that touched this model to submit their original assumptions within the hour, Daniel said, his voice calm but carrying quiet authority. The instruction moved instantly through the room. Assistants began sending messages, analysts pulled up archived data, and for the first time the process felt less like execution and more like examination. The chief financial officer nodded as he reviewed incoming figures. We are already seeing variations in how those assumptions were justified, he said. Daniel did not seem surprised. Of course we are, he replied, because we never forced them to be questioned at the same level. His eyes shifted briefly toward Sophia, then back to the screen, as if connecting two separate realizations into one. Consistency creates confidence, he added quietly, but it can also hide mistakes. Across the table one of the senior executives adjusted her glasses, studying the revised structure with a new intensity. If we rebuild from the base inputs and verify each layer independently, we eliminate that blind spot, she said. Daniel nodded once. Then that is what we do, he said without hesitation. There was no resistance now, no hesitation, because the room had already accepted that the old framework was no longer sufficient. Sophia remained still, listening, not intervening, not directing, yet her presence continued to shape the direction of the conversation in ways that did not need to be spoken. Daniel finally turned toward her again, this time with something closer to curiosity than calculation. You did not hesitate, he said, you did not ask for confirmation. Sophia met his gaze evenly, because the pattern was clear, she replied. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, then asked a question that shifted the tone once more. And if you had been wrong? The room stilled again, not out of tension but anticipation. Sophia did not look away. Then I would have learned where the pattern breaks, she said, her voice steady. The answer did not defend itself, it did not need to, it simply existed as truth, and that made it land deeper than certainty ever could. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering that response, not dismissing it, not challenging it, but understanding something within it that extended beyond the moment. Most people avoid being wrong, he said quietly, because they think it weakens them. Sophia gave a small nod. It only weakens you if you refuse to see it, she replied. The words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not tied to numbers, not tied to projections, but to something more fundamental, the way decisions were made, the way confidence was built. Daniel exhaled slowly, then looked back at the screen one final time before speaking again. We move forward with the corrected model and the rebuilt assumptions, he said. The decision was clear, final and accepted, but what remained unspoken was just as important, because the outcome of the deal had changed, yes, but so had something else, something less visible and far more lasting, the way this room would think from this moment forward. And as the analysts continued refining the data and the executives aligned their strategies, Daniel Harrington understood something he had not needed to understand before, that control does not come from having all the answers, it comes from knowing which questions were never asked until now. The momentum in the room no longer needed direction, it carried itself forward with a precision that had not existed before. Every screen displayed layers of recalculated data, every voice that spoke did so with intention and restraint, as if each person had learned something they could not unlearn. Daniel Harrington remained seated, but his presence had not diminished. If anything, it had sharpened. He no longer dominated the room through assumption, he guided it through awareness. His eyes moved across the updated projections once more, not searching for errors but confirming alignment. Report the variance between the original and corrected models across all key metrics, he said calmly. The senior analyst responded Immediately pulling up comparative charts, revenue projection improves by 32% over the next 2 quarters, risk exposure decreases by nearly half, and operational efficiency increases across 3 major divisions. Daniel nodded slightly, absorbing the data without reaction, but the significance was clear. This was not a minor correction, this was a structural shift. The chief financial officer leaned forward, reviewing the same figures. If we had proceeded with the original assumptions, we would have committed to a strategy that underperformed across every major indicator, he said. Daniel did not look at him when he answered. We did not proceed, he replied simply, and the distinction mattered because it was no longer about what could have gone wrong, it was about what had been corrected before it did. The room held that understanding quietly. No one needed to say it aloud. Sophia Bennett remained where she stood, still composed, her presence now fully integrated into the space, not elevated, not singled out, but undeniable. Daniel finally turned toward her again, his expression steady but different from before, less guarded, more direct. You changed the outcome of this deal, he said, not as praise, but as fact. Sophia did not react outwardly. The model changed the outcome, she replied. Daniel held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod. Because you questioned it, he said softly. A brief silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective, the kind that settles after something important has been understood. One of the senior executives, who had been silent for most of the meeting, finally spoke. We built that model based on historical consistency, she said carefully. It has worked for us before. Daniel turned slightly toward her. Consistency is useful, he said, until it becomes unquestioned. The words were not criticism, they were clarity, and they carried through the room with quiet authority. The senior analyst looked up again, his expression thoughtful. The corrected framework is holding across all tested scenarios, he said. Daniel nodded once more, then leaned back slightly, not disengaging but recalibrating again. Then we finalize the revised strategy and prepare for implementation, he said. The decision was clear, final, and accepted without hesitation. But before the room could fully transition into execution, he spoke again, this time slower, more deliberate. And from this point forward, every assumption is reviewed, not just for accuracy but for origin. The instruction landed differently than the others. It was not about this deal, it was about everything that would follow. Sophia met his gaze once more, and in that brief exchange something unspoken passed between them, not acknowledgement, not approval, but understanding, because what had happened in that room was no longer just about correcting a model, it was about redefining how it was built in the first place. And as the team moved forward with renewed precision and focus, Daniel Harrington understood something he had not needed to consider before, that the strongest systems are not the ones that never fail but the ones that are questioned before they do. The meeting should have ended there by all conventional standards. The problem had been solved, the strategy corrected, the projections aligned, yet no one moved to leave, not because they were waiting for instruction but because something in the room demanded to be understood before it could be left behind. Daniel Harrington remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze no longer fixed on the screen but on the people around him, one by one, as if reassessing not their roles but their awareness. We have spent years refining systems that reward precision, he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying further now. But precision without perspective leads to confidence without verification. No one interrupted because there was nothing to interrupt. The truth had already been demonstrated. Sophia Bennett stood where she had been for several minutes now, still composed, still quiet, yet her presence no longer needed to be acknowledged, to be felt. It was already part of the structure of the room. One of the senior executives leaned back, slowly exhaling as if releasing something she had been holding on to. We trusted the model because it had worked before, she said. Daniel nodded once, and because no one challenged where it began, he replied, his tone not critical, not defensive, simply clear. The chief financial officer glanced down at the revised figures again, then back up. We built layers of validation on top of a single assumption, he said, more to himself than anyone else, and each layer reinforced the one before it. Daniel's eyes shifted briefly toward him. That is how errors survive, he said, not by being hidden but by being accepted. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. The senior analyst, who had been working continuously since the correction, paused for the first time, his hand still over the tablet. The new model is stable across all stress scenarios, he said. It holds under pressure. Daniel gave a slight nod but his expression did not change. Then we move forward with it, he said simply, but there was something else behind the decision, something that extended beyond the numbers. He turned his attention once more to Sophia, his gaze steady, not testing, not questioning, but acknowledging something that had already been proven. You did not just correct a line, he said, you changed how we see the entire structure. Sophia did not respond immediately, her eyes remained calm, her posture unchanged. The structure was always there, she said softly, it just needed to be seen clearly. A brief silence followed, not empty but full of recognition. Daniel leaned back slightly, now his shoulders relaxing for the first time since the meeting began, not because the pressure had lifted but because something had been resolved at a deeper level. Most people look for answers that confirm what they already believe, he said quietly. Very few look for the one detail that proves them wrong. He paused just long enough for the weight of the words to settle, and that is usually the one that matters most. Around the table no one disagreed, no one challenged, because they had all seen it happen in real time. The room that had once been filled with certainty was now defined by something else, awareness, and as the final adjustments were made and the strategy prepared for execution, Daniel Harrington understood something that could not be written into any model or projected on any screen, that true control does not come from being right, it comes from being willing to question what feels right before it is too late. No one rushed to close their laptops, no one reached for their phones. The meeting had technically reached its conclusion, but something in the room held them there, not out of obligation but because leaving now would mean stepping away from a realization that had not fully settled. Daniel Harrington remained seated, his posture composed but no longer rigid, his hands resting calmly on the table as his gaze moved once more across the people in front of him, not to evaluate, not to command, but to understand. We built a system that rewards confidence, he said quietly, and then we trusted that confidence without asking where it came from. The words were not directed at anyone in particular, yet everyone felt them because they were all part of it. The senior analyst looked down briefly at his tablet, then back up as if seeing his own work through a different lens. We validated the outputs but not the assumptions behind them, he said. Daniel gave a small nod. Because the outputs matched what we expected, he replied, and expectation is the easiest thing to trust. A faint silence followed, not uncomfortable but reflective, the kind that forces awareness rather than reaction. Sophia Bennett remained still, her presence unchanged, yet the space around her had shifted completely. She was no longer the intern in the corner, she was the point of reference, the one moment in the meeting that had redefined everything. Without raising her voice, without demanding attention, Daniel turned his attention to her again, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. You did not follow the process, he said, you stepped outside of it. Sophia met his gaze calmly. I looked at it from the outside, she said simply. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering that answer not as a contradiction but as an expansion of what the process should have been. And that is what we missed, he said, more to himself than anyone else. We never stepped outside our own model. Around the table a few executives exchanged brief glances, not defensive, not dismissive, but thoughtful, because the statement did not accuse, it clarified. The chief financial officer exhaled slowly. We optimized within a system we never questioned, he said. Daniel nodded once. And today we saw what happens when someone does, he replied. The words settled into the room with quiet certainty, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable. The senior executive who had spoken earlier straightened slightly, her expression more focused than before. Then the adjustment is not just the model, she said, it is how we approach every model moving forward. Daniel did not hesitate. Exactly, he said, his voice steady. The decision had already been made, not in words but in understanding. The room had shifted from correction to transformation, and that shift would carry beyond this meeting, beyond this deal. Sophia remained silent, but her silence no longer meant absence, it meant completion. She had said what needed to be said, not through volume but through precision. Daniel looked at her one final time before turning back to the table. From this point forward we do not just ask if something works, he said, we ask why it works and whether it should. The instruction was simple, but its impact was not. It changed the standard, not just for this team but for every decision that would follow. And as the room slowly began to move again, as laptops closed and documents were gathered, there was no return to what had been before, because something fundamental had been revealed, not in complexity but in clarity. That the most overlooked perspective is often the one that sees everything differently, because it is not bound by what everyone else already believes. The room did not erupt into applause, it did not celebrate what had just happened, because what unfolded was not the kind of victory that made noise, it was the kind that changed something deeper, something quieter, something that stayed long after people walked out. One by one laptops closed, documents gathered, chairs moved back across polished floors, but the energy that remained did not leave with them. Daniel Harrington stood slowly, this time not as the figure who controlled the room but as the one who had just learned something from it. His gaze moved once more across the now emptying table, then settled briefly on the screen where the corrected model still held steady, not flashing, not unstable, just clear. He turned and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city below, for a moment saying nothing, watching the movement of traffic far beneath, as if measuring distance not in miles but in understanding. Behind him the last of the executives stepped out, their conversations quieter than usual, more thoughtful than before, until only two figures remained. Daniel and Sophia Bennett. She had not moved much throughout the meeting, and she did not move now, her posture still calm, her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, and perhaps to her it had not. Daniel turned from the window and looked at her directly. No distraction, no divided attention, just clarity. You knew it was wrong the moment you saw it, he said, his voice no longer carrying weight of authority but of recognition. Sophia met his gaze without hesitation. I knew something did not align, she replied. That is where I started. Daniel nodded once, slowly, taking that in not as information but as perspective. Most people start where they are told to, he said quietly. You started where it did not make sense. A faint pause followed, not empty but complete, the kind that does not need to be filled. Sophia did not respond because she did not need to. The answer had already been shown. Daniel walked back toward the table and stopped where he had stood earlier at the beginning of the meeting, the same place where confidence had once come easily, where certainty had not been questioned. Earlier I said something, he continued, his tone steady, something I thought was a joke. He did not elaborate, he did not need to, the meaning was already clear. In the silence that followed he looked at her again, not with hesitation, not with doubt, but with something far more grounded. I do not make statements like that lightly, he said, and for the first time since the meeting began there was no distance in his voice, only truth. Sophia remained still, her expression calm but attentive, as if listening not for what he said but for what he meant. Daniel exhaled once more, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as a conclusion but as acceptance.